Dr. Hoff! Long time no see. And now I know why. Last we left Dr. Hoff, he was in Washington, D.C., advising us on the realities of white privilege and white fragility. Now Dr. Hoff's globetrotting continues, as he takes us all the way to Lima, Peru. Why Peru of all places? Let's find out.
Hey everybody, reporting live from the awesome, vibrant city of Lima, Peru. And I just looked at the waves, a little bit of high tide, but there's some nice lines coming in.
Oh man, I hope there's some awesome surfing footage coming up with Dr. Hoff riding some wicked waves.
And I thought I would use this time to talk about, since I'm in a city with a history of colonization, primarily from the Spanish. Yeah, I thought I would use this time to talk about decolonizing our therapy practices.
Decolonizing our therapy practices. Okay, for reference, let's remind ourselves of the common definitions of colonization before we continue. The action or process of settling among and establishing control over the indigenous people of an area. The action of appropriating a place or domain for one's own use. The action by a plant or animal of establishing itself in an area. Okay, I am looking forward to seeing how any of these definitions are construed to apply to therapy practices. Let's continue.
And I don't know if you know, but Peru lost 93% of its population due to Spanish colonization. And it can be argued that the colonization efforts have resulted in long-term intergenerational inequities of distribution of wealth and systems that are still present today. There's a lot of inequity still present in the city, and you can see it in a lot of different ways, with a lot of wealth distributed unequally.
Right. So, in this analogy, I'm assuming Peru represents the therapist, and the Spanish represent your practices? Maybe?
And the framework I thought I would use to guide this quick conversation on decolonizing our therapy practice is the great article, Decolonizing Academia, Intersectionality, Participation, Accountability in Family Therapy and Counseling by Doctors Teresa McDowell and Pilar Hernandez-Wolfe.
Aha! Another academic paper. Well, let's take a look at that before Dr. Hoff gives us his assessment. First, let's read the abstract. In this paper, we offer a framework for supporting decolonizing practices in family therapy and counseling that reflect values of human diversity, collaboration and participation, distributive justice, and self-determination. To this end, we propose a vision of social justice involving at least 3 foundational elements of professional development and organizational leadership: intersectionality, participation, and accountability. We include case examples throughout to illustrate our points and offer practical suggestions for decolonizing praxis in the Academy. We conclude by revealing dilemmas we have encountered as a result of these efforts. I'm still fuzzy on what decolonizing means in this context. Let's read a bit further. Over the past 2 decades, mental health programs in traditionally white institutions in the United States have been pressured to increase diversity and rewarded when able to do so. This has led to contemporary academic landscapes portraying greater diversity through inclusion of women, sexual minorities, and darkened bodies. Darkened bodies. Okay. Moving on. However, superficial inclusion and visual diversity does not in itself reflect the type of transformation necessary to ensure that our fields, departments, and programs support cultural democracy and social equity. Equity being just another word for justice. Okay, so superficial diversity doesn't really change anything or say anything about the quality of an institution. I would tend to agree on that point, though the goals of cultural democracy and social equity sound awfully creepy to me. A bit onward in the paper. The healthcare industry bears pressure on professional organizations, the state, and the Academy to produce therapists who can and will work within capitalist care-for-profit and state-funded minimal care structures. Well, yes, it's not called the healthcare industry for nothing. We're a capitalist society, and therapists, like everyone else, need to make an income. At a macro level, these multiple systems, i.e. the academy, professional organizations, the healthcare industry, and the state, privilege Western colonial perspectives, including individual diagnosis, evidence-based research, rational scientific theories, and manualized treatments. Yes. I really hope our authors aren't going to argue against evidence-based research or rational scientific theories. A decolonizing agenda in the academy does not routinely dismiss Western science or the worthiness of existing mental health practices. Does not routinely, but it does occasionally dismiss Western medicine? Okay. But contributes to just practices and cultural democracy through A. critiquing and challenging colonial agendas, B. acknowledging the legitimacy of indigenous and previously subjugated knowledge and performance, and C. centering liberation-based healing practices. I have absolutely no idea what any of that means, but it sure sounds like it's saying evidence-based science and rational scientific theories are tools of intellectual colonialism and are part of some undemocratic, unjust agenda. And I'll just end this portion with how the authors describe themselves to the reader. The voices emerging in this essay are those of a heterosexual, presently able-bodied Latina, mestiza, and a white-privileged, presently able-bodied straight female who was raised in the Southwest U.S. in a patriarchal, middle-class family. For having dismissed superficial characteristics in academic landscapes as ultimately unproductive towards change, you two sure seem obsessed with your own superficial characteristics and caveats. But, back to Dr. Hoff.
And although their article is geared more towards academia, I think we can use their framework to kind of frame this conversation about decolonizing our practices, our therapy practices. And they offer a framework for decolonizing practices in family therapy and counseling by using 3 foundational elements, and those are intersectionality.
Intersection. The art of taking several unrelated problems and creatively connecting them into one vast criminal conspiracy of oppression.
Participation and accountability.
Participation and accountability. The cynical part of me translate those into the buzzwords of showing up and acknowledging one's privilege. But I'm probably jumping to conclusions.
And they use the term colonization or colonism to refer to the promotion of dominant group ideologies, beliefs, and cultural practices for the purpose of maintaining centered positions of cultural, social, and economic capital.
Does that include evidence-based research and rational scientific theories?
They also make a very important distinction, I think, that they state that a decolonizing framework stands on a perspective of coexistence rather than opposition to Eurocentric thinking, because unlike Eurocentric universal endeavors, decolonial projects seek to be pluriversal, meaning why take one idea and try to center it over others? You would just be doing the same thing that colonizers are doing, basically.
Well, I don't know. Has that one idea been shown to be reliably effective through evidence-based research? Or should the other ideas not be held to such a standard?
So how might the first element of intersectionality inform our practices, our family therapy practice as well? It could start by therapists should be aware of the privileges and oppressions that the intersections of their social locations create. We should honestly examine how we're complicit to forms of oppression and how we can be responsible to forms of oppression.
So, in order to decolonize one's therapy practices, the therapist must acknowledge how their privileges, derived primarily on what they are, rather than who they are, contribute to hurting others. So, therapists need to conduct a self-hating guilt trip over things they have no control over. Got it.
Therapists should be ready to initiate conversations with clients about intersecting identities and their influence because we are in that power seat.
Therapists need to have conversations with their clients about intersecting identities. So, if a married couple is seeking counseling for a decrease in romance between one another, such clients need to be confronted with their intersecting identities, how their race, gender, and disability status, or lack thereof, need to be examined.
I was taught early on that it's my responsibility, because I'm in the power seat of the therapist, to raise questions of race, genders, sexualities that might not otherwise get raised because of power relations.
You were taught to raise questions on race, gender, and sexuality that might be wholly irrelevant to the situation at hand, or not topics of concern to the client? That's interesting.
And which leads us to the third piece for how intersectionality might influence our practices, is that we should always be examining power relations.
Power relations. I'm not sure what that means either. Also, those sudden cuts to different locations are not my jumping over big chunks in his video. Those are his edits.
So how might the second element of McDowell's and Hernandez-Wolfe's framework for decolonization, participation, play out or inform our therapeutic practices? Well, I think it absolutely starts with a decentering of the therapist as the expert, decentering their expert knowledge. This is once again us examining our power and being accountable to that power.
The second point in the framework is participation. So that involves the therapist, the person being paid to provide their expertise towards helping clients resolve their issues. This means the therapist needs to abandon their role as the expert?
We're definitely avoiding normalizing judgment. Oftentimes therapy is about moving people to what is considered normal in the dominant culture.
Yes. If you have someone with anger issues who hits their spouse, generally speaking, the dominant culture and the law would prefer that they be in control of their anger and not lash out violently at their loved ones. But the dominant culture would be wrong? Or should be held in doubt?
And we're absolutely about avoiding that normalizing judgment or that movement towards some sort of idea of normal. And with that in mind, we must be always willing to abandon ideas of logic or ideas of rational thinking.
We must be willing to abandon ideas of logic and rational thinking. I'll just let that one speak for itself. Though, to his credit, Dr. Hoff does seem to be preaching the gospel as laid out in the paper he's referencing.
We must always be inviting hybrid forms of knowledge with an understanding that our clients have our access to many different wisdoms, knowledges, spiritualities, practices, rituals that we should always be asking about, or try to access.
I presume this relates to that passage in the paper which said, acknowledging the legitimacy of indigenous and previously subjugated knowledge and performance. So, the therapist, the expert being paid to help the client or clients resolve their issues, needs to instead defer to other wisdoms or rituals the clients might possess. if the clients had other wisdoms or rituals that would resolve their issues, then why would they be coming to see a therapist in the first place?
And then finally, I think the last piece that, at least for this little segment, for participation would include self-determination by our clients, meaning a kind of a true collaboration that the client determines what's helpful, what is helping, the client is guiding us in this practice, and they're always operating from a place of personal agency in our work together.
Well, yes. Ultimately, the client is going to decide whether your advice is working for them or not. And therapy is a kind of collaboration. But if the therapist is coming to the table immediately apologetic over what they are, and is willing to immediately discount or abandon their own expertise, rather than risk making the client feel as though there is a power imbalance, tell me again, of what use is the therapist?
This brings us to our third and final element of McDowell's and Hernandez-Wolfe's framework on decolonizing, and that is accountability. And in their article, McDowell and Hernandez-Wolfe write that simply acknowledging positions of privilege allows for false accountability that maintains individual advantage and systemic oppression. So it's not enough just to admit, well, yeah, I'm white, male, hetero, cisgendered, I got privilege, that we need to do more both in and out of the therapy room.
Well, I wasn't wrong on that one. Accountability involves acknowledging privilege. But apparently acknowledging privilege is not enough. Confessing your inborn flaws, I assume to your client, isn't enough for the therapist. Well, what is enough? I have no idea.
You know, and I guess as privileged people, sometimes we get captured by the idea that we could do it for or solve for. They write in their article about how those with privilege often get captured by this idea of solve for rather than with. And I think that's a very important distinction, that oftentimes in this work of decolonizing, we're being asked to decenter ourselves as well, not just as therapists, but also in the activist work. We're being asked to decenter ourselves as well, which it doesn't come easy for people that are used to having privilege.
The phrase decenter is sounding more and more to me as a synonym for psychological self-flagellation, or wallowing in self-doubt and second-guessing of oneself. Honestly, that doesn't sound like someone I would go to for counseling. That sounds like someone who needs counseling.
That's my video, and I look forward to hearing from you. And as always, please click like or subscribe or click share. Share this video with somebody you think might find it helpful or useful. It would be very much appreciated. And I'm off to Cusco now, and then Machu Picchu, and then home, and I'm sure I'll have more content both on the podcast and on the channel. So thanks for watching. My name's Chris Hoff, and this has been The Radical Therapist.
Well, thanks for another interesting installment, Doc. Between Dr. Hoff's video on perfection, and then on white privilege and fragility, I keep coming away with the notion that what is being preached here is a process of self-devaluation. That positioning oneself as an expert, let alone a paid therapist, requires an imbalancing amount of self-pity and shame. That to be in a position of power or authority is, inherently, something to live down and not live up to. Now, I am not a psychologist. I am not an expert in these areas. But as a relatively logical and empathetic person, as someone who has struggled with uncontrollable depression and reflexive self-doubt over most of my life, I have to say that I cannot understand why choosing to be down on yourself, professionally or otherwise, would instill confidence in your clients. Because when someone brings their sorrows to a therapist, they're looking for a way out, not for the therapist to become what their misery loves most: company. As always, thank you for watching.